Have you ever noticed how young children often go fearlessly into dangerous situations? They walk into the middle of the street without a care in the world. They pick up sharp knives without caution. And sometimes they even go right up to strangers, take their hands, and start to walk off with them, completely oblivious to the violence other people can pose. But of course, adults know that the world is full of all kinds of trouble. Natural disasters destroy life and property. Diseases bring suffering. Machines can harm us. And we know that perhaps the greatest dangers of all are those posed by other people. Men and women commit violent acts of assault, murder, and war on their fellow human beings. If we are aware of human history, or if we're just paying attention to current events, it's nearly impossible to deny that human beings have filled this world with violence. We have entitled this lesson, A World of Violence, and we're going to look at Genesis chapter 4, verse 1 through chapter 6, verse 8, where Moses described the troubles and violence that took place in the world shortly after humanity's fall into sin. In these chapters, Moses described how human beings began to fill the world with violence and how God reacted to those troubles. We will examine three aspects of this portion of Genesis. First, we will look at the literary structure of this material. Second, we will focus on the original meaning of these chapters. And third, we will explore how the New Testament teaches us to apply these passages in our own day. Let's look first at the literary structure of Genesis chapter 4, verse 1 through chapter 6, verse 8. These chapters in Genesis touch on a number of different topics and include both narratives and genealogies. Now, these complexities often leave us with the impression that these chapters don't fit together very well. But when we examine this portion of Genesis more closely, we'll see that it is a carefully crafted literary work with a unified purpose. As we look at Genesis chapter 4, verse 1 through chapter 6, verse 8, we will see that this portion of Genesis divides into two main sections. The first section consists of chapter 4, verse 1 through chapter 5, verse 32, and we have entitled it Early Violence and Hope. The second section consists of chapter 6, verses 1 through 8, and we have called it Later Violence and Hope. The early scenario of violence and hope of deliverance in Genesis chapters 4 and 5 divides into four parts, and these parts form two parallel sets of narratives and genealogies. Chapter 4, verses 1 through 16 form a narrative which parallels a second narrative in chapter 4, verses 25 through 26. And chapter 4, verses 17 through 24 form a genealogy which corresponds to a second genealogy in chapter 5, verses 1 through 32. We will examine these materials by exploring some of the relationships between the corresponding narratives, and then we'll give attention to the parallels between the two genealogies. In the first place, Moses began by writing a story about sinful Cain in chapter 4, verses 1 through 16. This passage is the well-known record of the time when Cain broke into a fit of jealous rage and murdered his brother Abel. When we look more closely at this passage, it becomes apparent that it divides into 5 dramatic steps. The story begins with Cain and Abel living together harmoniously in verses 1 through 2a. Even so, when we turn to the end of the narrative in verse 16, we find a different circumstance. Cain is alone, banished from the good land, from his family, and from God's special presence. The second step of the story, found in verses 2b through 7, touches on the events that led Cain to murder Abel. Specifically, the distinction between the sacrifices each offered to God. Put simply, God was pleased with Abel's sacrifice, but he rejected Cain's sacrifice. God also warned Cain about the power of sin seeking to master him, but Cain paid no attention. The third section of this narrative, verse 8, forms the turning point of this story. In this section, Cain murdered his brother Abel. Cain and Abel went away from the place of sacrifice into a field, And there, just as God had warned, sin mastered Cain and turned him into the first murderer in human history. The fourth section of this narrative appears in verses 9 through 15 and describes the curse and protection God gave to Cain. God placed a curse on Cain by banishing him to wander far from the land of Eden, but he also protected him from being attacked by other people. So we see that Genesis chapters 4 through 5 begin with the story of Cain's terrible sin. He was so corrupted by sin that he actually murdered his righteous brother Abel. And as a result, he was destined to live far from the place of God's blessing. Now that we have seen the structure of the opening narrative of Genesis 4 through 5, we should turn to the second narrative which appears in these chapters, the corresponding account in chapter 4, verses 25 and 26. This passage turns attention away from sinful Cain to Adam's third son, righteous Seth. The report of righteous Seth divides into 3 short steps. First, in chapter 4, verse 25, Eve gives birth to Seth. The second step in this report appears in 4:26a, where Moses noted that Seth also had a son, Enosh. Nothing much is made of this event, but Moses followed his report of Enosh's birth with a third step in 4:26b, where he added a telling comment on the spiritual character of this family. In 4:26b, Moses wrote these words, "At that time, men began to call on the name of the Lord." Put simply, Seth and Enosh were men who called out to God in prayer. In contrast with sinful Cain, these men were righteous before God, and they demonstrated this righteousness through faithful worship and prayer.